Greetings, friends. It is Wednesday, miércoles, so StarryTelling hour at our new time, 11:33 a.m. Pacific, because family's at baby music class, at music together class in the morning. So I'll be coming in with that spirit. La 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 la. The la la's are kind of hard to come by right now. However, what crazy times we are living in. And our adventure today is going to be tuned to the Astro maps of this very recent event, Donald Trump's second inauguration. Spelled incorrectly, but maybe that's actually somehow oddly correct. There's a U there. As I just saw this some time ago, that this map points to Panama and to Greenland and to Israel and Ukraine and so many places that are, up right now. And we'll see. I mean, I don't have the time today. This is going to be a bit of a shorter one. But really, I'm enough of a skeptic in astrology that I like to see it proved true. And so a way that we could do that is to go back and look to AstroMaps for previous inaugurations, right? Like Ukraine and Israel should be clearly indicated in Biden's inauguration if the AstroMaps of a presidential inauguration in the United States, for example, are going to show the entanglement of that country, the United States, for example, with other places in the world. Then we should be able to go back in time and see how that looks. I mean, I have looked at the birth chart of W, for example, and has a lot of Iraq in it, which probably won't surprise you. So do the Towers event. So does the Towers event. But anyway, let's take a peek at this map on the screen. And then maybe I'll share a couple other things that I've been tripping on with you on the other side. Please feel free to add your comments or questions to the chat. And we'll see what we have time for together today. So the time I have seen for the official inauguration, I didn't watch it, but it was 12:02 p.m. I did watch some highlights and lowlights. And it's a pretty wild chart, I mean, just that it's the Sun Pluto, coming up on the first Sun Pluto Cazimi for about 250 years. It's a pretty wild thing to see. I was interested in seeing this from more of a feet on the ground point of view, which thanks to Stellarium astronomy software we can do pretty easily. So let's head over to DC on January 20th, 25 at 12:02 p.m. I've seen people write 12:01 and I've seen people write 12:02. My friend Gary Caton was pointing this out, which is a pretty interesting thing to see, which is that Altair, the alpha star, the bright star of Aquila of the Eagle constellation, is culminating at the time of this inauguration. And by the way, that would be true for each of these inaugurations in our day and age, well, at least since they were moved to January from March. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'm going to go back 4 years and we'll see. I'm just going to do 12 p.m., which is typically what's written for the ceremonial time. I mean, if that's the time that's elected, and then maybe people aren't able to pull it off and do whatever you have to do to make it official in that moment. But if that's the time that's elected, just look at how every 4 years, this is what we're going to see. Let's go back 4 years. So this is Trump version 1. And the second Obama. And the first Obama inauguration, which looks like a new moon with Jupiter, interestingly. I haven't played with these charts much, have you? But either way, we're going to see this here, okay? I mean, we'd have to go back, like, let's say it was 100 years before to 1905. And you'll see that that star is not as close, okay? We could also just go 1 year because of the leap year system, and it's not going to be as close either. But I think a really interesting thing would be to look at, when did U.S. presidential inauguration move from March, where it was, I believe, since George Washington, to January? Does anybody know? Like, there was a bunch of things happened at that time, like how U.S. senators are elected. So, sorry to bring you along with me on my research. I should write these things down, but let's just type in, when did U.S. inauguration move to January? The 20th Amendment ratified in 1933. Interesting number, that. So, and there's an image in the article I'm looking at of JFK inaugurated in January. Let's look at inauguration of George Washington. No, I was doing today, I was looking at the amount of executive orders by the presidents. Like, George Washington served for 8 years and there were 8 executive orders, right? So obviously averaging 1 per year. And Olive, I'm seeing you mentioning FDR here. FDR by far was the champion of the executive order. Now, he served for more than 12 years as US president, but if you just look at the average, it's absurd. It's like, well, what happened to like 3 branches of government? How is it that the president just acts like some monarch and just makes these executive orders? I mean, there's some that Trump has made already that likely will not pass or will be challenged. We'll see. I mean, some of them just straight up unconstitutional when it comes down to it. So George Washington, April 30th, 89. Let's look at Thomas Jefferson. March 4th, 1801. Let's look at John Adams. March 4th, 1797. Yeah, so that kind of marching forth thing was the way, this is the way, until 1933. Let's just, I mean, I could find a list of every inauguration ever. It'd be really interesting to go through those charts sometime and see what they have to say, but let me just type in like Abraham Lincoln. You know, of course, some, like Lyndon B. Johnson, inaugurated on Air Force One after Kennedy was assassinated, right, that day, right? Those aren't going to be similar times. Interestingly, Abraham Lincoln was March 7th instead of March 4th. No. Weird. Well, one source is telling me, Wikipedia is telling me March 7th, and history is telling me March 4th. So I don't know what's up with that. Anyway, it's interesting to consider, like, if we just speak astrologically and as basic as we get, go sun sign astrology. What's the difference between March 4th and January 20th? Anyone? On top of this question, so please educate me if you know, how long has it been that U.S. presidential elections are held in November? I'm going to always find this to be a fascinating thing, that presidential elections, I mean, general elections in the US happen on, speaking of Mars's day, Tuesday, and a month when the Scorpio is moving through, when the sun is moving through Scorpio, one of Mars's domiciles, according to the tradition, right? So I don't know that you would call that a Mars month, but if you would, the sun moving through Aries or Scorpio, how interesting that presidential elections are happening on Mars Day during a Mars month. Interesting. Um, there's a trine that used to happen between election time, Scorpio sun, inauguration, Pisces sun, and the Independence Day in July, Cancer sun. So what's the shift when we move from kind of that water sign story to Aquarius? I mean, many would see the Aquarian nature as this republic, or, this vision for a better way. And saying here, elections used to be held anytime states wanted, as long as it was finished by a date in early December. Sorry, I don't remember when. Yeah, interesting. So I don't mean to get caught in this rabbit hole. And she says until 1845. Thank you, Ann. But it's a rabbit hole I've been considering. Another thing I've been considering is that we're just moving into the year of the snake, and like the Chinese calendar. Interestingly, I've learned this when I was in Japan. At some point, Japan changed to initiating the new year on January 1st, right? So they're going into kind of this change. They're already in the year of the snake. I just learned this last year. I assumed that the shifting of the Chinese zodiac annually would happen at Chinese New Year, which is a lunisolar thing, right? It's the visible new moon in Beijing. But I learned last year that that's not true, that the official shift from one year to the next happens according to the solar calendar, the solar terms, the 24 solar terms, which we tropical astrologers would know as the sun at 15 Aquarius. All right. And, interestingly, there's a presidential election or inauguration every 4 years, right? And 4 years out of a 12-year cycle of the Chinese zodiac means there can only be one of three possibilities for an inauguration of a US president, and dragon would be one of them, right? It's crazy how much just rabbit hole random research I do. It's somewhere in here I have the order of the animals. Yeah, so and many of you could just know this, but rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, pig. And so since this thing was moved to January 20th in 1933, as long as it's been keeping a 4-year pace since then, and mathematics would suggest, yes, besides the time of presidents coming in after a presidential death, it's either going to start in a rat year, a dragon year, or a monkey year, right? But then shortly after, transition from rat to ox, in this case, from dragon to snake, or from monkey to rooster. And I think that's a fascinating thing to consider. I would have to know a lot more about those particular archetypes. That being said, hopefully like sun sign astrology is just a gateway drug into the real thing. Knowing your the animal of the Chinese zodiac of your birth year, and not starting at January 1st, at least in China, is just the gateway, right? There's also an animal of the month, an animal of the day, and the animal of the hour. And so that's another kind of interesting thing to consider, which is that if these things are scheduled for 12 p.m., then what hour is that? Okay. Discerning light here clarifying as well. She's saying branches and stems, but that it's wood snake in the coming year, right? So it's not just a 12-year cycle, but rather a 60-year cycle. And that reminds me to share with you, this is something I'm very excited to share with you, that I'm gathering for a very good purpose with many fellow astrologers. Next week, I won't have StarryTelling Hour next week on January 29th. I'll probably just start a very short video to tell people to come over to this happening. Let me get this on the screen for you. Buttons. My dear friend Ursula Stockter is a wonderful astrologer who's had a cultural center in Mexico City, turned her own home into a cultural center where she's supported many astrologers coming through, including myself, needs help. Cancer treatments for her husband, Rolando's now sadly passed, just drained the funds, and now this cultural center might be lost. So I'm gathering with many other allies, like Maurice Fernandez, who's very much organizing this thing for Ursula, Nadia Shaw, Lynn Bell, Owner Doser, Yuria Robles, who I can't wait to hear more about the Mesoamerican system, Alexander Imsaragic, and then Merriman Cassells, who will speak about the year of the snake. So I'm always really excited to hear more about different cultures' approach. You'll see this QR code here. Oh, let me get a web address for you so you can go by and send in a donation and then sign up for the webinar, which will be next week, Wednesday, January 29th at noon Pacific time. So I'll pop into StarryTelling Hour just for a minute to rap about it, but then encourage you to come join us in this other space. So it looks like Maurice has a page at his website, mauricefernandez.com/astrology.ursula. I'm going to put that in the chat here. I really hope you'll come sign up. We're asking for, well, that's a weird link that just showed up. Let me take that one out and try again, actually. Okay, let's try that again. Oh, the ones and the O's. Okay, there you go. So mauricefernandez.com/astrology.ursula. I'm going to post that over here on Instagram as well, so you can see that. It's kind of an honor system. You'll find at that webpage the Zoom registration, so you can sign up. But we're asking for you to send a donation of 250 pesos or more. It's about $12 US. Sorry, I can't convert to all currencies worldwide or to Bitcoin at this moment, but you can do the math, okay? I really hope you'll join us, and I really hope you will support others who are in a challenging time, like folks in LA, North Carolina, or around the world. Okay, so speaking about around the world, let's get to the topic at hand. I hesitate to start sharing some of what I see in this chart itself. There's some crazy stuff. I will say I like seeing a Libra moon. I wonder about that moon who is just squared Mercury and is applying to square this retrograde out of bounds Cancer Mars very close to the IC in DC at the time of this inauguration event. That being said, I like seeing the Neptune trine down there, but we can go any way with Neptune. The Uranus trine to the midheaven. I do like knowing that Venus has now passed Saturn by, and then Venus is the steersman of this Taurus rising chart. So I want to try to stay as optimistic as I can. I'm also just intrigued to see the polarity of all things And just like this wave, like Trump signing all these executive orders, many of them just to cancel Biden's orders that he wrote to cancel Trump's orders. But if you're able to get out of that and not be on one side, but rather watch the game, right, from the sidelines, oftentimes we'll see a team like set so their teammate can spike. If you're watching from the sidelines, I think in this case, you will often see someone from one team set the ball for the other team to spike it. And so when I see things like, but I'm just going to leave that there and let you do your own play. All right, let's look to these maps. And maybe I'll just explain a little bit about how these AstroMaps work. There's two different techniques I'm going to show. First, let me just do this. We'll just look at the rising signs. The way I love to teach this is that in any moment, the Earth is like a 12-paneled beach ball, right? And in this moment, DC was in the Taurus panel. Right? It's everything between here and there. So was Venezuela. So was most of Brazil. It's hard to combine that giant country in one of the beach ball panels at any time. We find Israel at the time in the Leo panel, and that's true for most of Europe. But Russia's over here in the Virgo space, and most of China in Libra, while Beijing, Wuhan, and some other spaces on the coast in the Scorpio realm. Do you see how that works? So for whole sign astrology, I can't necessarily tell the difference between Washington, D.C. Let's just put a chart up here. Or in Brazil, like they're all Taurus rising, and Taurus rising charts have Aquarius for the 10th whole sign. Now, it is not uncommon that when Taurus is rising in DC or other spaces north of Earth's equator, that we pair that ascendant degree with a Capricorn midheaven. Okay. And, it's not like Taurus is always rising in DC. It is always like Taurus will rise in DC a few hours before it will rise in LA, right? Because DC is east of LA and the Earth spins from the west to the east. So you can think of astrocartography lines, and these sign lines are astrocartography lines, as astronomical events. DC here has not yet spun into this Gemini rising space. Do you see what I mean? It's actually just put a chart up, and Astro Gold now actually lets us move through time, which is amazing. And this has gone public, by the way, this update. So if you have Astro Gold on the Mac and you haven't updated yet, definitely do. Some amazing new innovations here. Okay, we're just going to watch DC and watch what happens an hour later, right? You see Gemini on the rise in this chart now, right? Because DC has now spun into Gemini rising. A couple hours later, it will have spun into Cancer rising, right? Let's go back a bit to this inauguration time. All right, so when I look at astrocartography lines, they basically speak about the power of angularity. And, before we even put them on, let's just see in this chart what we should expect to see. We'll see the sun near the midheaven line, or we'll see DC near the sun midheaven line on the map. Okay, the sun in DC had not yet culminated, right? Every day the sun will rise at the ascendant. It will reach its daily height at the midheaven, and then it will rest at the descendant in the west before rooting beneath the ground in the middle of the night and coming up again. What is the most angular planet on this chart? And the answer is Mars. Yes. So again, we could see things like, Uranus trine midheaven, stronger trine between Neptune and the descendant. We can see Saturn trining the descendant, Saturn in sextile with the IC. Obviously, I meant to say Neptune trining the IC and Saturn sextile the ascendant. Geez. The angles are all so powerful that I guess I can't discern one from the other, but it's long been known in our tradition that planets that are going through phase changes, whether that's changing direction, changing sign, changing which side of the ecliptic it's on, or changing state, like is it beneath the ground and coming up, rising? Is it above the ground and resting? Is it well above the ground and it's reached its height before it shifts from going up to coming down? That's what happens at the midheaven, or we believe beneath the ground, shifting from going down to coming up, which Mars recently has in DC before this inauguration event. Okay, so when I put these astrocartography lines on the screen, we're going to see here in DC, and I guess I can add cities. All I get is near Baltimore, although it's the crossing of this ascendant line and this midheaven line, or the origin point of all of these lines, and we'll get back to what they are in just a second. We're going to see that DC has just recently spun through this Mars at the IC event and has not yet spun to this Sun at the midheaven, or Pluto at the midheaven, or Uranus rising, right? When we get to the chart again, Mars has already anti-culminated. The Sun has not yet culminated. Pluto has not yet culminated. And Uranus has not yet risen. See how that works? So what astrocartography tells us is like there's these places on Earth in any given moment, like your birth moment, that have these planetary strengths, that have these planetary signatures. Like Hawaii is interesting at this time, for example. So going back to this, well, hindsight should tell us more about how astrology works, right? I mean, the Lahaina fires happened during Biden's presidency. So would we see Hawaii as indicated in the Biden inauguration chart? Again, we ought to go back and look at a bunch of previous inauguration charts to see if the AstroMaps of those charts do speak about, in this case, the US, or we could say other countries as well, like how they're kind of participating with or entangled with other places in the world. Could somebody tell me where the WHO is headquartered? Or we can look it up. I know Teapot is currently like, I don't know, what they call it, the emperor of it? Because I imagine that you have seen by now that one of these gazillion executive orders that Trump signed yesterday was to leave the WHO. I'm personally a fan of that one. You don't have to be. But also to separate from the Paris Accords, right? So I imagine we can look to Paris for that one. Let me type in, where is the WHO? World Health Organization headquartered. Geneva, Switzerland. Somebody already probably wrote that in the chat. Thank you, Susan. You beat me to it. I should just wait. Somebody wrote, "This is not a sports game. Goodbye." Okay. Bye. Oh, right, because I was comparing politics to volleyball. Yeah. All right, dude. Okay, so as my friend Neil Kramer says, okay, you're right, it's not sports, it's the entertainment division of Empire. Anyway, I'm not suggesting that people won't be hurt by decisions of politicians. I don't mean to not take this seriously enough for people. I think I take it actually more serious, in my opinion, than others do, just in a very different way. You'll be told that Trump won the popular vote, did he? And the answer is no. You know who won the popular vote? Neither of them. Maybe you remember the great film Brewster's Millions, but perhaps I'm dating myself. None of the above. All right. Okay. So anyway, another time, if you'd like, or maybe on our own times, or for those of you who are in Constellations in the School of Astrology's membership group, I think this would be a great way for us to explore, play, learn together. And yes, I think study is play, like a sports game. Uh, like maybe we should look at these things and see if there's anything there. All right. I want to put one other technique on the screen. Actually, before I even do, let's just look at these. So, Geneva, Switzerland, is there something here? Because, day 2, separating from the WHO. And it's not showing up in astrocartography, by the way. It's an important reminder, however, that these lines that show us like where planets are rising, this is where Mars was rising at the time of this inauguration, or reaching their height. Like here's Uranus at the midheaven. We'll get back to that because you can see some interesting places nearby. Or resting, setting, like this is where the sun was setting. So while it's just about midday in DC, the sun has just set in Paris, for example, where the moon was at the IC, right? We can find the powers of planetary angularity on AstroMaps thanks to this wonderful computer creation called Astrocartography, first code cracked by Jim Lewis, But we can also look to places like if I just relocate the chart, and for me, the relocated chart is like the crown jewel of relocational astrology. Really, astrocartography just helps me see more about relocational astrology, okay? But when I look to this relocated chart, I'll see things like in Geneva in this moment, Leo is rising, Aquarius is setting. There's a semi-square between the Sun, Leo, and Saturn, Aquarius, which might be an interesting thing to see. But just because we don't have planets at the angles, it's interesting to see the part of Spirit was culminating, was aligned with the midheaven there in Geneva as it was in DC in this moment too. We'll see things like Jupiter trine descendant, and I'm not going to say that that looks like the U.S. separating from the WHO at all. I just wanted to point this out and remind you, like, not to sleep on aspects to the relocated angles, like in this case, Mars squaring the midheaven in the IC, squaring the meridian, right? So this Astro Gold software and many others will actually let us map things like that. So if I asked the computer to show me aspects like squares, we're going to see through Geneva here the Mars square I see in Mars square midheaven. By the way, interestingly, they're in different places on this map. They'll go to the same place if where's my button? Where's my button? Do this. Okay, so zodiacally, Mars squares the midheaven while Mars squares the IC. All right. But, and then here's Geneva, and there's Mars squaring the midheaven, the IC from a zodiacal point of view, which you can see in this relocated chart for Geneva, right? And by the way, that to me carries some astrological context of this thing that just happened with the WHO. Why, when I click this magical In Mundo button, is the place where Mars is squaring the midheaven different than the place where Mars is squaring the IC. That gets into a level of astronomy that I don't necessarily want to teach right now. I will just give you the answer, which is that Mars and all of the other planets is not confined to the sun's path. So when we're looking at a chart wheel, we're looking at the ecliptic, we're looking at the sun's path, and then we'll take planets that are off of the sun's path, unless they're at their node, and draw a perpendicular line down to the sun's path. Okay, so where the degree that a planet projects to is rising is different than where the planet is actually rising, for example. And that's the difference between what's called in Zodiacal and in Mundo. And that debate goes way further back than AstroMaps, like all the way back to the beginning of our craft, and calculations for powerful timing techniques like primary directions, for example. Venus here says, love your style, Jem. Thank you. Somehow we're talking about Prince William's C-section. I don't know how we got there, but I must have missed a lot. What aspect is over London? Well, we can relocate this chart to London, right? So if this inauguration chart for a president, again, says how are they going to participate with a different nation, it's interesting to look at that nation's chart in the same moment. Of course, it was not 12:02 p.m. in London at the time. I could relocate over here in this software, and they'll actually update the time zone for me as well. Of course, in any moment of time, the planets are going to be in the same degrees as the same signs. We actually measure that from the center of the Earth, but from the surface of the Earth, we measure the houses, right? London actually looks pretty similar to Switzerland or Geneva over here, interestingly, in this moment. But we see things in the London map like Moon at the IC and Chiron at the midheaven. Mercury squaring those two, right? Because one feature of this moment, again, is a strong Moon Mercury square. And so where Moon is angular, Mercury's squaring that angle, in this case, the IC, and the angle opposite the midheaven, right? I'm curious as to why you asked. It'd be interesting also, by the way, to look at Brussels, right, where the EU is centered, and to look at many other countries. I want to show you one other AstroMapping technique first. I'm just going to look at these few places that have come up. I don't know, in the last month, some of them, in my experience, like Greenland. And we'll look in this moment. I got to turn off these squares. We start adding all of these different aspects, and things can kind of the map can just get overrun pretty quickly. Where is that? Uh-oh. Oh, aspect. Okay. Sorry, I'm still getting used to some of this new ability. All right, well, look at Greenland. Or let's start with Panama. It's pretty telling in Panama. Mars is at the IC. Now, an interesting thing that has recently occurred was the death of President Jimmy Carter, right? Who gave the Panama Canal, sold the Panama Canal to Panama for $1. I don't know if any of you, speaking about the ball game I was speaking of earlier, watched some of the interactions between the red and the blue team at Jimmy Carter's funeral. It's pretty interesting. It kind of looked like Obama and Trump were besties in that moment. That's a different kind of moment, but you just see this kind of president's club and that division that's so promoted on our television screens. I would say especially at election time, but it really is always a great way to divide us all. The wall doesn't seem that high when you catch people and in a different stage. Another thing that I'm very much tripping on is, well, who took over for Jimmy Carter? And the answer is Ronald Reagan. And that was, what, 1981? And what was one of the main events at the changing of the guards or the changing of the presidents then? I'm just going to say no comment to one that came in recently. And I encourage a deeper look. Yeah, how about the Iran hostage situation, right? So there's this weird echo that's happening now, isn't there? And it's intriguing to consider that it's like 44 years. If you tell me something like 79 years, I'm like, oh, that's a Mars and a Mercury cyanotic cycle. 83, oh, Jupiter cyanotic cycle. 36, oh, it's the Saros series and 3 trips through the profections. And you know what I mean? At 44, I'm like, well, what is that? What is that frequency? I guess it's a Saturn opposition. It's a little bit earlier than it typically. I think we usually get that at 45 years of age, halfway between the first and second Saturn returns at 29 and a half and 59 years respectively. So I'd have to go look at charts, But that's one of the great gifts of astrology, the opportunity to study the wheels within the wheels within the wheels, right? To look at cycles and cyclical time. And it's tricky because, it'd be one thing if we were just looking at the sun going through the signs each year, or the moon each sidereal month, or tropical month, but we have all of these variables. The equations get pretty ridiculous. And sometimes I fear that I'm just working with a system of enough variables that I can get it to say anything I want. It's intriguing, especially when you look at a chart or look at people looking at a chart who are very kind of steeped in a particular politic. And I would even say anti-politics is a politic, isn't it? But like you can two astrologers, they may be even trained in the same school, but one's on the red team and one's on the blue, and they're using the same chart to make exactly contradictory, calculations or opinions or predictions. So it's really hard to get the observer out of the experiment. It's very hard to get the astrologer out of the prediction. You know what I mean? Okay. So, let me just, Sun conjunct Pluto, one might see that as just complete power trip. One might see that as power to the people. One might see that as like the Hades cloak and helm of invisibility. One might see that as shining light on invisible things and showing us the MLK and JFK files, and we shall see. I think there was a promise about news about the drones on day one. To my understanding, it didn't come through, but I gotta say I haven't been looking every hour or something. I would go crazy if I did. Right. So like Haneen says here, underground being exposed, right? Like a contradictory statement, or I'll call it like the retrograde side of that would be like, burying the underground things even deeper, right? And it's like, it's tricky in astrology when we get these kind of clear images of energies that themselves are not necessarily clear. I personally am deeply troubled slash, I'm sad to admit this, but I think entertained by watching how the blue team and the red team simultaneously respond to a particular executive order. right? I mean, and I really encourage you to do, especially if you're identifying on one side of the wall, make sure you go look at what the other side's seeing. And I would really encourage us all to ask people about why. Why do you see it that way? Um, Linda asks, who said Pluto makes the small huge and vice versa, and the huge small? I haven't heard that before. That's interesting. I have to trip on that one for a bit. Haneen says, I get the party colors so confused. Sounds like you're winning. Somebody before said, discerning light, same bird, different wings, as they say. All right, well, back to the map. So we hear these things like Trump saying that it's time for the United States to take the Panama Canal back. If any of his reasoning is true, I'd say there's some interesting points there. He's like, look, China is like taking a stronghold in this place, in the continent that our country is. We built it. We're being asked to pay billions of dollars for repair, but we are being mistreated. I don't know if any of that's true. I know that that's what's been said publicly. If that's true, kind of an interesting thing to take a peek at. Going back to the astrological expression of the timing of the Panama Canal's construction would be a great way to look at this. I'm not going to do that today, but it's something I really encourage for you to do. Discerning Light says, I thought it was interesting that Trump announced the Stargate AI infrastructure on Pluto's sun, Cazimi, and Aquarius. I think that's a really, really good, interesting. That's very interesting. And other things of like, AI, mRNA, ... There's things I still can't say on YouTube. Interestingly, right? Susan writes here, seems like some of you were working together. Said it was Alan Leo who said that Pluto makes the small huge and the huge small. Interesting. Violet says, concerned about Mexico and Canada. Any thoughts? What are your concerns? I'm concerned that, again, I need to be careful with language. Literally on this forum, at least one of these places still. And that's an intriguing thing, by the way, to consider some of the changes in the other two places I'm going to live to right now. But one of the executive orders declared particular people, defined them in such a way that, like, since 2001, there's a lawlessness that allows for military and kind of secret actions to take place. So hopefully you know what I'm talking about. Somebody's asking about the strange salute. Yeah, I thought that was terrifying. However, it's interesting if you go watch in some of the places right now examples of how many people, including people who are just grilling Elon about that, doing the exact same thing, because oftentimes people in like stages will kind of point up and point to the crowd and stuff. I don't know. It scared me when I saw it. And either way, especially if it's not intentional, it's like, dude, consider the times. Anyway, all right. Well, let's get to this map. I keep saying that and then not doing it. So when we looked at Panama, we see this Cancer Mars at the IC, right? Now the Panama Canal is closer to Panama City here, right? It's on the Taurus side, Taurus rising side. Not all of Panama is, but the Panama Canal, it looks like it's actually kind of skirting the Aries rising, Taurus rising divide. Let me just like move around there and show you a chart at the moment. Kind of from Panama Canal's like from here to here, I believe. Right. So you get like, this is 12:02 p.m. in DC. I think I must have this London chart up still. So with a line this close, like a minute is going to change it significantly. So I want to be careful with that. But like undoubtedly, we have this Mars at the IC line heading down there, right? I mean, you'll remember that Mars is very near the IC in DC, right? We see that in this DC chart. And what does this tell us? Well, the ICMC, they're on the meridian. It's the north-south line. Okay, it just tells us that Panama is south of DC. However, while Mars is not exact, the Washington, D.C. IC, when we relocate this to Panama City, really? Is it just Panama? It is. Yeah, look at the proximity here, right? Especially zodiacally. The IC 24 degrees 23 arc minutes and Mars at 24:23. Now, by the way, I had seen that the inauguration was scheduled for 12 p.m. A few different astrologers had this 12:02 chart on there. I have not investigated enough personally, by the way, and I'm sorry I don't have their names to share. But check this out. Like if I just go 2 minutes before at that scheduled 12 p.m. time, and we're looking at this Panama chart. Whoa, what just happened there? Okay. Oh, it relocated us back to DC. Okay, so here's 12 p.m. and then let's relocate to Panama. Yeah, I mean, it's not like Mars is not there, right? 23:54 at the IC and Mars is at 24:23. But if we go 2 minutes later and then relocate this thing to Panama again, and somebody remind me to send an email to the software because I would rather not see that relocating as I move through time. Look at that. I mean, it's the exact to the arc minute. So zodiacally, this Mars IC line is exactly through Panama, where, of course, in Panama City, the decisions for the country are going to be made, right? Any deals are going to be made, etc. It's kind of like maybe they waited for that. Because what would Mars at the IC mean? There's potentially a separation in home, in the land, and even like what we own, it can be. Typically we think of that as like a second house theme, but the fourth on so many regards is like what's in the soil, like even what's in the culture, right? Cancer, Mars retrograde. I can't wait to look at a chart for the Panama Canal. I mean, and typically that would be like, okay, it's open for the first boat to go through, like fully. It's like, but it'd be interesting to see like when the project started. Obviously, it was like one of the biggest engineering projects in modern times, right? So Cindy does right. 12:02 was when he was exactly sworn in. Now later in the speech, and again, I only saw some highlight lowlights, but there was this whole rap about Panama. So it'd be interesting to also go look at in that moment. Winter says like Civil War, Mars and Cancer at the IC. Well, so it'd be intriguing to go look back at like the Abraham Lincoln inauguration chart and see if there's a similar symbol, right? I think we want to be careful with creating images that can kind of run amok in our own consciousness, and maybe, as they say, we're creating our reality. What are some other ways we might see that, right? I mean, there's a lot of energy down in like the land. There's a huge patriotism. I mean, even whether or not there's an actual war that erupts, just the crazy division between this side and that. On one level, we kind of often invoke that Gemini nature of hot and cold when we get into those topics, and it might be one reason why a cat who's chosen Gemini as a moniker is fascinated by the division tactics and the sideism, and it just seems so much louder than it was when I was young, but maybe I just didn't have to look. But now it's like you have to look. Do you know what I mean? It's or you just have to shut it all down and just talk to people if you don't want to. But even then, I can't drive around. So anyway, there's a lot of Cancer Capricorn in the tribalism, and I gotta say, it's like a word that I missed when we were looking ahead years ago to 2020 and the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto gathering in the sign of Capricorn, nodes there, eclipses there as well. Like tribalism would have been a really good word there. And that word can live in Cancer as well, especially like clanism, even like cult, right? It's not where we typically, I think, lean when we consider those archetypes and that axis, but I think it does very much live there. Nadine asked, don't you think the division was as strong in the McCarthy times or Vietnam protests? Yes, but I was also not alive yet. And so for me, that's all history books or, hearing from reports or from what people had to say. But yeah, there's some pretty interesting echoes there too. So again, wheels within wheels, and I appreciate that point. Haneen saying the climate has changed significantly for both parties over the last few decades, with orthodoxy and common sense perspectives altered and marginalized. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy to see as well how the ideals of a team have completely shifted to the other one. It's like, what again, like brings me back to my volleyball metaphor. Okay, we see ridiculously strong Mars at the Panama Canal at this time. One of the reasons is because Mars is at the DCIC, which, by the way, is always due north for the Northern Hemisphere spaces like DC. But north is just south when you go all the way around the world, because it ain't flat, cats. All right. If I was in this moment of time to feel Mars down beneath the ground, and I held you up in that particular direction, let's go back to DC, where we find Mars just slightly separated from the IC, which again, this is due north. Like it's the meridian of the chart that is Earth's directions. That's not true of the ascendant descendant, by the way. Like Taurus rises north of east, Scorpio sets south of west, but this is due south, the northern hemisphere midheaven, and this is due north, the northern hemisphere IC. Okay, to be accurate, I should say for northern hemisphere places that are located north of Earth's tropic of Cancer. That is always true. I can show this wonderful device. This is called a local space compass. I think first dreamed in by the great astrologer Michael Erlewine. And we'll see Mars is almost due north. All right, so the way this compass works is like compasses that you're used to. North is up, east is to the right, south down, and west. Okay, so the good example here, you see how close the moon is to the due west direction? But if you think the IC is due west, or sorry, the descendant is due west, oh my God, I need to sleep. You would be really shocked to think of the moon as west if you think of this descendant degree as west. The descendant and the ascendant are only east, west and east respectively when zero Aries or zero tropical Libra are rising and setting. Okay. Anyway, I can add these local space lines here. And these are going to show me in AstroGold, they're called planetary direction lines. These directions, okay? So now look at where Mars heads. And the answer is north, almost due north. He's going to come all the way around the world, by the way, and come through Panama. And pretty close to that Mars at the IC astrocartography line, right? We saw, by the way, if I shift that Mars at the IC astrocartography line to the zodiacal calculation, that it's exactly through Panama City. All right, so that's just a lot of Mars pointing from DC to Panama, or let me say it this way, connecting DC and Panama. All right, well, north of Panama is DC, and north of DC is Ottawa. All right. By the way, most astrocartographers prefer the in-mundo calculations, which consider how far a planet like Mars is from the sun's path. I like to look at both of them. It is the relocated chart. These charts are only going to show us the zodiacal calculation, where we project planets to this path of the sun. All right. And so if I didn't believe in Zodiaco, I would have to have much more complicated charts to explore my own astrology and that of my amazing clients. So there's another planet that's actually exact to Ottawa. Why am I concerned with Ottawa? I mean, I'm concerned with all of Canada. I'm concerned with a place that's northwest of Canada called Alaska. Interesting to see Jupiter, who many connect with opportunity in Alaska. Interesting to see Uranus, who many connect with technology in Alaska, right? On one side, it's like, oh, drill, baby, drill. We have all this opportunity for technology and energy. Do you see that combination? Now, what about the idea that Jupiter is in fall or exile in the sign of Gemini, right? How is that going to do for the environment? What is it that Trump signs an executive order to change an executive order from Obama to, take a mountain back from its native name and name it Mount McKinley again? Those kinds of things are quite interesting. Looking at where Jupiter is in regards to Trump's own Gemini signatures at this time is interesting, right? But I just want to point things out on the map that I find to be intriguing. And one of those is Ottawa as well. So many of you know that Ottawa is going through a significant change in government. So how will that affect kind of the connection between DC and Canada, which is really clearly indicated in the planetary directions or local space lines? In DC at this time, Mercury was just a little bit west of south. That's this purple line. Let me zoom all the way out. Just learned that in Astro Gold. For y'all who play with this software, you can hit Command M when you're zoomed in on the map and it goes all the way out. I'm going to show just the local space lines. Notice that they all emerge from Washington, D.C. because that's the radix position. That's where we cast the chart for. But then they will reconverge at the exact opposite side of the globe. Okay, that's called the antipode or the antipode. And then they'll come back. So Mercury in this case is actually heading down to Panama as well. Can this connect a thread of conversation, an ability to come to an agreement? Is that part of what Mercury does? Here's the Astro Gold interpretation. I'm not sure who wrote this, maybe Stephanie Johnson. Mercury is the planet ruling the intellect, therefore moving to locations along your Mercury line is likely to involve intellectual pursuits such as schooling and studying. Now, obviously, this is like looking at relocational astrology for an individual. What would Mercury do? Let's get more specific. What would Capricorn Mercury do? Let's get more specific. What would out of bounds, and barely, Capricorn Mercury do in the ninth of foreign lands, foreign languages, other cultures, etc. do? Like, does that open a conversation? In a way, who's having the conversation? Well, mundane astrology will read a chart a little bit differently, well, a lot differently than we would for a person. But I'm just going to say, like, for now, that's an interesting thing. Looking at Mars' declination, Mars much more out of bounds than Mercury now. But in some senses, they're coming into not only an opposition in zodiac degree, but also an opposition in declination or a contra-parallel. It's intriguing to see at this time that the moon is translating the light of Mercury, who she has just squared, to Mars, who she will square some hours after the inauguration. Moon Chiron is a pretty intriguing thing too. Many people, I think, are really feeling that, right? Like, there's a lot of difficult feelings and fear, and it's like a lot of homes will be disrupted in these things, right? And so anyway, I'm hoping that in Panama, maybe this Mercury thing helps. Look, it's like even before the inauguration, things significantly change in Ottawa, and I think you all know that I'm talking about Trudeau, making the announcement that he will leave office after there's a robust competition for his replacement. Look, Mars is heading up there. One of you asked earlier, what about Canada and Mexico? You're concerned. And, I mean, like Trump has that schoolyard bully tactic, right? And is that because he's a schoolyard bully? I mean, that would be the easiest place to go. Is it because he finds that to be successful in his route towards negotiation? Doesn't mean it's good or bad, or I'm just asking a question here, okay? Now, this can be just a revenge move. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the video of Trudeau mocking Trump when he was president the first time around, right? So maybe he was like, well, I'll show you. There could be something deeper than that. I don't know how y'all like Trudeau's politics, or the World Economic Forum or other things, It's hard for me to believe there's a good side and a bad side. By the way, I don't want you to think that I'm on one side or the other. I really try not to be. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully, kind of the new, what do you call it, regime, prime minister, and in Canada, like hopefully that's also a clearer line of communication. So time will tell. Regardless, we see the AstroMap clearly indicating connections between DC and Panama and between DC and Canada, and specifically through Mars. This retrograde out of bounds Cancer Mars at the IC a couple of weeks ago. I just kind of considering here on StarryTelling hours, this like Mars overload. And through Mercury. And Mercury in Capricorn in the 9th of the DC chart. It's an intriguing thing to consider. I want to just show also, however, that is not untrue for Ottawa or for Panama City, as we saw. Like they're all in the Taurus zone. So at least from a whole sign perspective, let's just wiggle this relocating thing around. We're going to see that Ottawa and that Panama. Let me actually type in Panama City again. Yeah, all three of these places, Washington, DC, Ottawa, Panama, have that Capricorn Mercury in the 9th. Will that be helpful? Let's go look at Ottawa as well. And we'll see Mars very close to the IC there. Here we see Uranus at the ascendant, right? And so going through a great change. Like that's pretty clear. And, that we had news of that as soon as Trudeau announced that he would be leaving office. Yeah. And so the question there is, if these AstroMaps for events like a presidential inauguration speak clearly, could we also use them to make predictions? And would they maybe, like an eclipse, most astrologers agree, also in a sense take effect before they take effect? It's an intriguing thing to consider. Look, I mean, this could have been the exact same chart. I mean, maybe it wouldn't have been 12:02 p.m. Maybe it would have been 12:03 or 12:01 or 12 on the dot or 11:58 of like a Kamala Harris inauguration, right? So until I guess the election results are announced, it's kind of hard to read it one way or another. But I mean, just kind of all intriguing things to consider. I wanted to get back to see if there was an answer when I asked, like, what specifically are your concerns about Canada or Mexico? I mean, I can assume I could share what my concerns would be. I don't think it came in. All right, let's look to some of these other places. So, and there's some things coming in. I've like lost the thread. Yeah, somebody's speaking so poetically, I just can't quite get it. Okay. How about Greenland? So I'm intrigued to just ask folks who are here, like, what do you think about all the Greenland in the news? And why would the US want to become more involved with Greenland? How will that look, right? And by the way, this isn't new. Like Trump was speaking about Greenland. I understand. I didn't know it at the time. I wasn't looking as much. Like these days, I'm looking. I don't know because I guess I'm concerned. A baby in the house and all that. Maybe I'm more concerned. I'm definitely concerned for friends I know who are very affected by these things for sure. Um, I felt quite affected during lockdowns and all that myself, so that might have got me a little bit more engaged. Um, Maybe it's that I've become more intrigued astrologically. I have a hard time when people go all political astrologically because I just feel this sidism. Hopefully, you're not feeling that here. I wish I could look at these things without sharing a particular point of view. I'm not great at that. All right. Anyway, it's not rare to see so many astrocartography lines up in the Arctics or down in the Antarctics. Like it's just kind of how the astronomy works. I don't want to go into that so much, but look at this. Like we have Mars and Mercury in a different way here in Greenland. This is where, in this moment, Mars is rising and Mercury is setting simultaneously. Some call that a Paran. So we have Mars, Mercury between DC and Ottawa in local space, between DC and Panama in local space. We have Mars near Ottawa and right through Panama in astrocartography. These are astrocartography lines. Jupiter is heading up pretty close in local space. You can see that emerging from DC like this, okay? But this is like where, oh, the sun is setting. Think about that. It's 12 p.m. Well, over here in DC, so I don't know, maybe it's 3 p.m. over here in Greenland, and the sun is setting. Yikes. So why the wish? You know, and the thing that Trump is saying publicly is what? He's like, yo, this is for national defense, and I've been on to that for some time. Right? So and why would that be? I mean, if you look at where Russia is, if that's the boogeyman, right? But Violet got it here. Does Greenland have lithium? Yes. All sorts of rare minerals were just discovered. You know where they also are? North Carolina. I'm going to leave that there. Yeah, how about lithium, rare minerals? And so Violet writes, I wonder how much grief Canada and Mexico are headed for. And yes, Greenland too. Yeah, so why would this be something for Greenland to grieve? Why might it be something for Greenland to celebrate? Yeah, I mean, I think you probably saw that Greenland governments was interested in meeting with Trump about this, right? They're under the rule of Denmark, but there's U.S. bases all over Greenland. So sadly, too much of this idea of who does what on a political scene has to do with military might and all that. Yes. Um, and I'm not saying I'm on board with that. I would rather love peace. I mean, the thing that makes me want to get in Trump's corner is him saying things like, I don't start wars, I end them. I mean, if that proves to be true over the next 4 years, for me, I want no war. And Violet says, why? They could wind up all dug up. Yes. Are they going to wind up all dug up regardless? There's an interesting question, right? Is so we say here he's a pathological liar. Show me a politician who is not. Right? I mean, like, show me a president ever who is not a pathological liar. And I know the instant response to that's the guy who just left. Are you serious? So it's just like, don't want to get into sidism or poke that bear. I think Trump, as a more obvious liar, has more of a clarity than others. Anyway, I encourage you to go look back through the executive order list. I was this morning. It was just like, wow, that's surprising. Because I kind of thought I would see like Trump more executive orders than anyone ever. I also knew I wasn't going to see that. So anyway, those things. Yeah, I just like, I really encourage trying to break spells. And again, the thing is, like, if you don't hate somebody you're supposed to hate, people assume you love them. I don't feel like it used to be that way. Bernie seems pretty earnest to me. Oh my God, do you know how rich he is and where the money's coming from? I really appreciate that. And I was convinced for a minute too. But go follow the money into that man's pocket and you will be terrified. Bring a lot of light in your heart and some good tea, speaking of. All right, so I don't want to get into name calling and stuff, but it's so hard not to like find champions in these races. But it's hard to find, I think, a person who hasn't been absolutely consumed by power once they get into office and probably long before. So that's a personal point of view. Maybe I'm wrong. Have I heard what Trump has said about Gaza? I'm terrified by any folks who think that there's only one side of that story, personally. I am intrigued by how rapidly this hostage thing started. We'll see how it goes. As soon as Trump said, what? All hell will break loose if that doesn't happen before I take office on the 20th. Right? So that's why I'm saying, like, bully tactics. Hi, sweetie. My baby came and that helps. Bully tactics, right? In this kind of game, sure, it's not a game. It's not a sports game, but bully tactics tend to be how things work. And I would never want to be anywhere near that. And I'm not happy to be a citizen of a country that would act that way. But I also like the idea of there not being hostages. That doesn't mean I'm for one side of that thing or the other, by the way. Yeah, so will there be digging in Greenland? Absolutely. Will there be digging if it's not the US doing the digging? Absolutely. Yeah, this is the new oil. Right? There's a lot of ease in believing that the electric car is super environmental, right? It's like very green. Okay, well, where does the electricity and the batteries come from? And the answer is burning shit, right? Like burning oil. So then it's like, okay, but having a big power plant that is regulated and is working in a much cleaner way to convert the petroleum into electricity than an automobile engine would, right? Like that's where it becomes much cleaner. Okay, but then you can look into things like the amount of electricity that's lost when you send the electricity from that power plant to your house or wherever you're, charging up your car, right? More interestingly, where are the batteries coming from? And look into some of the like horrifyingly unethical ways that these minerals are being dug. Where is that happening? Some in Africa, mostly in China, by the way. Right, so it takes gas to charge a car, or like, could be nuclear, could be coal. You're not going to find that around here so much, but just know that, I think it's like really easy not to, but just know that electric cars, like, they're still running on gas for the most part. Now, you'd say, well, they're not polluting the atmosphere, right? And that's interesting. But still, how did they pollute the atmosphere? Through whatever the power plant did and whatever was used to source not only the oil or gas or in the first place, but also the batteries. And one of the new games is going to be sourcing lithium and other rare earth minerals for these batteries. And yes, tons of it was just found. And so Nadine mentions here, for example, what about hydrogen? Yeah, like, what about actual free energy? What about shifting to a more environmental positive energy? What if we could power a car with solar? We're very far from that if we can ever get there. Well, it's still, where do the materials for the solar panels in my house come from? They're right above my head. I can feel all green, but right, like, where did that material come from? Or the battery that's in the garage downstairs, right? So I just think it's really important for us to try to be real. So yeah, I really appreciate the question, and it'd be interesting to speak with some people in Greenland. Are there any? Do you think, just, what would your heart respond, or let me say, actually, not even your heart. How does your mind respond? Do you believe some people in Greenland would prefer to be under the United States rather than under Denmark? Is it 100% no of all people in Greenland? What if they were given full independence, but in some deal with the US? Would that be better than not being independent because Denmark's got this weight over them for so long now, or whatever? I'm not trying to like paint Denmark as some like crazy evil empire either, right? But those are just all really interesting things to consider. The Canadian and Mexican grief, like, for me, the grief of people being deported, like, I'm terrified, of course, to see what's going to happen in the coming weeks. I'm terrified to see, like, the unconstitutional executive order that was just signed that just completely betrays the 14th Amendment. I imagine that one's not going to stick for that reason, by the way. But again, how was that spike set by the other team? I'd go explore that question. Do people in Greenland speak English? Let's find out. The official language of Greenland is Greenlandic, which is spoken by 85 to 90% of the population. Danish is also commonly spoken, especially in education and government. And I'm sure we could go on from there. I'm ignorant enough to just know that Iceland is green and Greenland is icy, which is, I'll just put that out there. I'm an American idiot. Not that we all are, just I am. Okay. Greenlandic is not only the national language, but is now the official language in Greenland by virtue of Act number 473, adopted by Parliament on June 12th, 2009. The Act on Greenland Self-Government. Studying Danish and English is mandatory for students in compulsory schools and also part of many secondary level study programs. So knowledge of the two languages is widespread. Other foreign languages frequently studied include German and French. Temporary visitors and residents often make up a large portion of the population. especially in the capital. Yeah, so like I know nothing about it. What I know and what I wanted to share with you today is it's intriguingly active on this astrocartography map. Now, what might these lines mean? What might it be that the sun is and Pluto are pointing there? I mean, that in some ways, especially as we know, this is an Aquarius Sun Pluto conjunction, right? This is now the Ottawa map. I want to put this back in DC. Actually, let's take a look at what the relocated chart in Greenland looks like. I shouldn't say in Greenland, in the capital city of Greenland, because there's so much Greenland, isn't there? Look at it, 64 degrees north of the equator. Wild. Let's check out what happens to the houses. Like Astro Gold can't even like show us how the numbers look because you have a Cancer ascendant and a Leo IC. I've seen tighter things than that, but that's pretty intriguing to see. And so we do get, this is like a Placidus house point of view in this moment. Other quadrant houses, in this case, at least in these small quadrants, will be pretty similar. Like here's a Porphyry house. See the Sun, Pluto in the 8th. Here's a Regiomontanus where they come into the 7th. We could get angular Mercury, which we saw. We get angular Sun, Pluto a little bit further north. We also saw Jupiter in local space, and we saw Mars. So Mars rising there. You see Mars pretty far from the ascendant, but this is an important difference between in Zodiacal and in Mundo, with Mars significantly north of the ecliptic right now and very far north of the equator, like out of bounds north. If we look at like an altitude list in this moment, we're going to see Mars is actually above the ground, even though the chart suggests Mars is below, right? And that means that Mars is like beneath the ground in Zodiacal. Let me just change and show you that. See how that Mars line went way up there? But in Mundo, Mars has already risen. And Mercury has already set. And again, they come together right here. So I'm intrigued by those symbols. I'm also seeing a Cancer ascendant with a Leo moon in the 4th sign right at the bottom of the well. The lowest part of the chart is not the IC. The lowest part of the chart squares the ascendant. And so this Moon Mercury and Moon Mercury Chiron, geometrically to a less extent, Moon Mercury Mars Chiron, it's like very centered in Greenland. And I would kind of see that as a significant change taking place and hope for, I'm looking to see if Moon and Saturn are parallel at this time, and they're not. Like I want to see a connection between Moon because Cancer is rising and Saturn because Capricorn is setting. But yeah, I don't know, like mundane astrology rules don't necessarily work like that. Like if I was looking at a negotiation between me and somebody that I'm coming into a partnership with, I would go 1st, 7th like I just did. In country charts, you might do more like 10th for your own local government and 11th for allies. Like there's a lot of different ways that can come around. All right, well, I said this was going to be short today, and clearly I already lied. So the people of Greenland are their own indigenous people. That sure makes it deeper. I doubt they want to be dug up. Curious about the culture history. I am too, and I'm totally ignorant of it. Yeah, I mean, just this is kind of a Uranian question, maybe it's an Aquarian question. There's other places in astrology and the language that we can go for questions like this, like what are the benefits of digging, right? What are the benefits of the opportunity for energy surplus to take us out of poverty, for example? And again, I know nothing about what's happening there. Olive says mostly Inuit, I think. Discerning light, this is intriguing, right? Will this also help more people learn about the culture? We're all asking these questions. Right? Well, actually, you're asking these questions. I'm just saying I know nothing. Jon Snow, except there's lots of snow in Greenland. Um, yeah, like that's intriguing, right? Cancer rising, Libra moon down at the bottom of the chart, and we want to like learn about this country, right? So Violet says my Aquarius moon doesn't like it. Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice if we didn't need energy at all. There certainly would not be StarryTelling hour. You know, there would. It's always StarryTelling hour in my head. I'm just usually talking to a wall, or usually more often to a tree or a hawk or something that's happening, right? So, I mean, that kind of deep contemplation, I think, is a very important contemplation of Pluto moving through Aquarius. Like, how does energy enslave us, and how does it set us free? How does the internet do the same or the opposite of, right? It's like those are very important questions for us all to ask right now. Clearly, we enjoyed gathering and studying these things together. I'm just going to plug Constellations, by the way, as I do, because at the School of Astrology, we do that. And I'm not just talking and reading comments. We all get together and talk, and we have regularly scheduled community discussions. I will be leading a discussion this Saturday for those of you who are in Constellations. GeminiBrett.com/constellations to go check it out. It really supports my work. But more importantly, it's a place where we folks who are so often alone in our study of this weird thing can come together and communicate. So, by the way, I just went over to Instagram and seeing a different thread. So we said, so what are the orders as you see them? Like the executive orders? There's literally hundreds. I mean, so I'd encourage you to go look. Doesn't he want to go to Mars is a question. Yeah, right. So there's a cool question too, because part of, the highlights, lowlights, depending on how you look at the thing of like the inauguration and the celebratory speeches afterwards were this excitement about going to Mars. So they think about like making Mars a new home, and we have Mars and Cancer at the IC. And by the way, like crazy out of bounds with a significantly Aquarian chart, right? Like, so I really appreciate you asking that question. Here's someone saying, or Anna, maybe, as a Canadian, this is really infuriating and worrisome. I mean, Trump has been speaking outlandishly about Canada, calling Canada the 51st state, which is frankly just insulting and terrible. I would love to know, how do you feel about Trudeau stepping down? Are you a fan? So I don't think, I mean, if anyone feels that Trump is serious about making Canada the 51st state, I think you're doing a good job of demonizing the person so greatly that you haven't been able to kind of see the results of how it works. I don't think he has any plan of trying to make Canada a 51st state. I think he's using bully, annoying, terrible tactics to achieve results in negotiation, Not a big fan at all. Ashley writes, I am personally skeptical that unlimited energy is really a good thing, like on a spiritual, psychological level. That's a very interesting statement. Scorpio Brett, I'm calling him Scorpio Joe these days, spends a lot of time in rabbit holes, which have suggested that free energy breakthroughs have been suppressed, typically under national security, for at least a century and likely more. Now, why? Maybe for that exact same reason. Is unlimited energy a good thing? Now, typically the conspiracy thread would be like, because you don't want people to have the energy, because if they have the energy, then we don't have power over them. So energy and power, it's just kind of interesting how those things go together, right? But maybe that's actually like a gracious shepherd suppression, not some evil controlling force. I have a hard time going to the gracious shepherd side, but I try to be like a optimist conspiracy theorist as well. It's not my tendency, but I really try to balance out going into like the dark zones, or I really don't actually know. Okay. No internet for over a week, went through withdrawal, no electricity, friends who lost homes, PTSD, a learning time. Yeah, I mean, it's so crazy. Like, I think most of us here, some of you more than me, were alive for many, 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 many years before all of these devices and these shiny screens and the internet. We are in a different world and still learning how to manage it, aren't we? All right. I can never be brief on these things. I thought I was going to be able to get a nap. There was no sleep last night. All right, let's go back to DC. And from an astrocartography point of view, by the way, it doesn't matter. Like the sun, Mercury, Pluto were setting in Greenland in this moment. Mars was rising in Greenland in this moment. Mercury and Mars were in a Paran there in this moment. Okay. But from a local space point of view, now that I have this cast for DC, once again, you see those lines coming from DC. So one more place for us to go look, I mean, might be more interesting to look at some of these places of concentration, like Spain and much of Western Africa. But I'm just interested in seeing some of these kind of obvious places. By the way, Jupiter at the midheaven in Iran, where Saturn is setting. So the Jupiter Saturn kind of square that's happening by Paran is pretty close to Kiev, meaning like Kiev's gonna like spin underneath that crossing just some hours. I can even show you now, right? Let's go hours after this moment. 1, 2. So like maybe 2.5 hours. For the sake of science, let's go back 30 minutes. Sorry, 1.5 hours later. Look at how Saturn was setting in Kiev and Jupiter's at the midheaven. Let's scroll up a little bit, and then I want to go back to the 12:02 p.m. Okay. Look at how Uranus is at the midheaven, right between Moscow and Kiev. Kiev, I mean, on the Leo rising side, Moscow on the Virgo rising side, kind of interesting to consider. Leo rising, Aquarius sun said to be in exile, Virgo rising, Capricorn Mercury in the 5th, out of bounds. I don't know where we'd want to go with that. What's due south of this place? And the answer is Gaza. I can't zoom in further than this, but I mean, this is going right through Jerusalem. And again, if I go back to the scheduled time of like 12 p.m., Uranus is not right through Jerusalem at 12:02. Yes. So how is it that on this day, at this 12:32 p.m., Mars is exact the Panama IC, and Uranus is exact the Jerusalem NC? Jerusalem now the capital of Israel, right? Which, by the way, happened when Trump was in office the first time. And so when this cat says, I don't start wars, I end them, really? Because what did that do? And it's, advertised. And of course, folks on one side of the net aren't going to believe a word of it or anything of it as like a great movement towards peace. I would imagine it contributed to some of the great just terror that's happening over there now. Uranus at the midheaven. What does it mean? Let me just, to kind of help show that. Let's relocate a chart in this moment from DC, where Uranus is in the first, coming up to rise, has a very strong trine to the midheaven. There's a Mercury-Uranus trine, right? Uranus pretty significantly connected. It's really kind of Mercury, Uranus, Mars, and what we call a wedge. Mercury, Mars, Uranus. Could go Mercury, Venus, Saturn, Uranus, Mars, if I kind of loosen up the orbs a little bit, what we call a trapezoid. So it's like really interesting. It's like Mercury, Mars are involved in this T-square, really a grand cross with Chiron. And then they're also involved in this wedge or trapezoid with Venus, Saturn, Uranus, Mars. Let me relocate to Jerusalem. So midheaven in Jerusalem at this 12:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in DC is at 23:26 Taurus and Uranus at 23:18. Like, oh my. All right, well, is that terrifying or does that offer optimism? Is Uranus the great liberator? Or is Uranus revolution? Is Uranus freedom? Is Uranus culminating in Taurus, where Uranus is said to be in fall, technology falling from the sky? Let you fill in the blanks there. I'm glad I can't know. The guesses I would make are all literally coming through my own personal contaminants. I think I'd probably most clearly describe them as, my own biases, my own belief systems. I sure pray that this means freedom, liberation. But how is that thing going to end in a way that is agreeable for all? Linda wrote, you have Uranus on the MC of your solar return chart. I'm interested in knowing, do you cast solar return charts for your birthplace or the place where you're energetically living, kind of relocated, or for wherever you are in the moment? Maybe they're all the same anyway. And when would your solar return, and how are you experiencing it this far? I have a friend who has Uranus transiting his IC. His house just burned down in the Palisades. I have a friend who has Uranus transiting the IC, and she just got pregnant for the first time after trying for a long time. I predicted both because I was obscure enough in my predictions, and something is changing significantly in regards to home and family. I'm so happy this is happening for the latter, and so sad this is happening for the former. Especially since he is one who had all sorts of shady insurance disappear some weeks before these terrible happenings in LA right now. Could I get good enough at this craft to be able to accurately predict a house burning down for the one and finally becoming pregnant and receiving this dream and an experience of a miracle for the other? Maybe. I don't know. Part of me actually is terrified by the very idea that you could. How do you feel about it? What we can see is the energies happening, and what I can see, what I want to share here with you today are these maps. There's a lot of things I said that I wish I didn't share, but for me, like, we're not going to be able to utilize this tool without authenticity. Right, like Paint says here, I don't think the planets differentiate between good and bad change. Yeah. Is that a human thing, the thing that we experience is, and that experience in matter, is it the same as the experience on a soul or spirit level? Like, those are interesting questions that we really can't answer. That kind of depends upon your own cosmology, spiritual. I mean, I'll say religion, really. So Haneen says, is it Uranus exactly conjunct the angle? Yes, at the time of Trump's inauguration, or second inauguration, just the other day in Washington, D.C., Uranus was exactly conjunct the midheaven in Jerusalem, and is right at the midheaven between Kiev and Moscow. And by the way, anytime something's at the midheaven in Jerusalem, it's between Kiev and Moscow, because that's just north of Jerusalem, right? That's how meridian lines work. They're north-south lines. And at the time, Mars is exact the IC in Panama. And then we saw Mars and Mercury connecting DC with Panama, and also with Ottawa, especially Mercury with Ottawa. And then we saw in Greenland the Aquarius Sun Pluto setting, Capricorn Mercury setting, and Cancer Mars rising. And literally Cancer Mars rising while Capricorn Mercury is setting. Now, what does it mean? Violet asks, where was Regulus at the time of inauguration? Regulus is at the first degree of Virgo. Let's end with this one. I got to give Mom a little bit of a break. So Regulus, the heart of the lion, was down here beneath the ground in the 5th house. This is 4, 5, 6. This is DC in this moment. There's Mars down at the IC, and you can see how far Mars is from the ecliptic, by the way. So in Mundo, we project Mars to the ecliptic in Zodiacal. Mars is much closer to like rooting than the degree that he projects to is. But Regulus is here. I wouldn't see personally Regulus like too significantly configured in this chart. Let's see what we see. Well, the part of spirit is somewhat close to Regulus. And actually, intriguingly, I hadn't noticed this before, but let's do one more thing. I'm going to put Trump's chart on here. I just have to stop the share while I open it up. Because I don't want to share names of and birth info of friends and clients. And speaking of, this is what I do. And by the way, I do my best when I'm connecting with individuals not to bring my biases or what I think is right or all of those things. It's been interesting times to really help me like be more and more true to my mantra of don't try to bring them to the light, learn to see the light in them and help them experience that, right? If you want to support the work and you're interested in how I play with charts, I haven't shown much of it today. Please book a session with me, GeminiBrett.com. While you're here, if this video has interested you, please give it a like. I laugh because I don't know, things can be interesting and I don't like them. Anyway, so here's Trump now inside. We're not exactly sure of Trump's birth time. I think this Regulus rising chart is right for Trump. Are there concerns about these angles, right? Look at how Uranus is not only at the midheaven of Jerusalem at this time, but at Trump's midheaven, right? And let me actually show you this. Let me relocate the inauguration to Jerusalem. Oh, it's not what we wanted to do, but okay. Here's Donald Trump in the Jerusalem moment where it was 7:02 p.m. on the clock during Trump's second inauguration. Look at the angles. His Mars degree, and Uranus at the Jerusalem midheaven at Trump's midheaven. I personally see that concerning. Look at Mars aligned with Trump's Saturn. I've been seeing, and those of you who've spent time here at StarryTelling Hour know that, the first time I got into this, charts of president's territory was just me expressing some of my worries that I've been worried about this being a time of the U.S. becoming involved in a very significant, world war for 10 years now. Just looking at astrology, looking at the Jupiter synodic return, we usually think that about Jupiter, looking at the Uranus return that's coming, and I don't want that. And so maybe I should just keep my mouth shut, because am I adding to that? So I'm going to finish in this way. Scorpio Joe is always wondering how the powers that shouldn't be are manipulating collective consciousness, right? And I was really intrigued by, especially given my cosmology at the time, which was a lot more rabbit holed and challenged, by the 2012 movie that came out shortly before the December solstice of 2012 and the turning of the Mayan long count calendar and all these things. I just couldn't understand why the powers that shouldn't be were kind of coaching us to create the end of the world. I mean, a friend of mine, John Major Jenkins, may he rest in peace or travel with much curiosity wherever he is now, more appropriately, just was so disenchanted by, that's not even there, was so attacked by. He would be interviewed as a great Mayan calendar scholar, Mayan cosmology scholar. Read John's work, these many books, but great books that I really encourage reading are Maya Cosmogenesis by John Major Jenkins, and also Galactic Alignment. It's like a must read. So John would be interviewed about the calendar turn, and then he would get to see the show that he was interviewed by, and they just twisted what he had to say in such a way that sounded like doom and gloom and the end of the world, and this whole thing that was being promoted, as you know, we would drive by these billboards where they showed a great tidal wave coming for New York or for Rio de Janeiro or for Tibet. And I just couldn't figure out why they wanted to steer collective consciousness into destroying ourselves. That's where I was at the time. And then that's not what happened. I was at Machu Picchu getting ready for the new world, by the way. And my world, definitely, my old world died and my new world began. Very much that's when I became an astrologer, which was not the plan. But here we are. And so I have since wondered if, when there's so much energy that such terrifying events might go down, is it actually healthy to have that nightmare displayed on the silver screen in a fictional work? Is it healthier just to not speak it, because where our attention goes, energy flows, as they say? Or is it healthy, especially with restraint and admission of I don't know, to express these things? Does it actually let that energy get out in such a way that it can't manifest in my reality? Do you see what I mean? Winter writes, it's a fine line. Yeah, I mean, I don't at all know, right? It's another thing, like depending on the client that I'm speaking with in sessions, I want to go with what they believe, what they know, the way that they play. Like I want to ask them, and then I want to participate with how they do that. You see what I'm saying? I don't want to tell them how, like, what to believe in or how to go. I mean, I'm guilty of that all the time. Don't get me wrong, but I really try to keep that in check and try to learn rather than teach. All right. Diane, it's really interesting to hear where minds within this cross section of folks. Much food for thought is shared that digs deep into hope and encouragement. Always good time spent. Thank you, Diane. Yeah, I want to say I am hopeful, and I just wanted to put this on. Like, well, what about these 8,000 soldiers? I didn't see a number before, by the way. And maybe that comment was, oh, here. I hear 8,000 troops were dismissed, but Trump's offering 4 years back pay to entice them back. I don't. Is that to entice them back? That's like it's interesting, right? Because what is that the motivation? Because it might be, hey, I'm planning, domination, and I need a gigantic army, and so all these soldiers who were dismissed because they weren't going to, because they were my body, my choice. I'll say it that way. I know that might anger some, so my apologies if it does. Um, they weren't complying to this mandate. He's now offering back pay, saying they were wronged. But what is the motivation? Right? So that's an intriguing thing. Can I celebrate that I feel it is justice for these people to receive an apology, which, by the way, was part of it as well? I believe in that, definitely, personally. And I'm happy to know that there will be back pay. Taxes might be a little stronger this year, huh? Um, but what is the motivation? Right. So often it's like I can get on board with a thing, and then damn it, if I knew why they were doing, I wouldn't have been on board at all. Right. So, well, who am I to know, especially when I'm not in the know? Anyway, there's some of my ignorance and also some of my astronomical knowledge. I like astronomy because there's right and wrong, and hopefully you got to learn a thing or two about maps at least. And we'll see how these things play out. And again, for those of you who are in constellations, it might be fun on Saturday in a community discussion group to explore some previous inauguration charts and see if some of the places that were clearly activated, like LA, by the way, and the presidency, are indicated on the map. The little research I've seen, by the way, I was a little let down to not see with clarity some places indicated that I expected I would. And then I'm very hesitant because I can just push enough buttons and enough aspect lines and params and like, see, it's that. And then I really fear, and I'm skeptical of the ability in astrology to add so many variables that we can have the equation say anything we want it to. I think on some levels that can be a great thing. On other levels, the scientist in me freaks out about it all. Well, I see a thank you here. Thank you. Kevin says, thanks for the discussion. Be well and be the light you already are. Thanks, Kevin. I'm learning to be that. I'm very appreciative of you seeing that in me. And I just want to thank especially those of you who know that my view is wrong, but that you chose to stick around anyway. And I can't, for me, let's be in the same room, especially when we have disagreements, and not try to convince the other person, but try to see where they're coming from and just honor that, you know what, we can still be friends anyway. I'm hoping that that's what this age of Aquarius will do. See you in space, friends.